Hello students, I am Dr. L.K. Das, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the Department of HSS, IIT Roorkee. Welcome to another lecture of the NPTEL course Power and Politics in Contemporary India, a Sociological View. Today we are going to discuss the puzzle, a puzzle that has the ingredients of a very successful movie. But we are not discussing a movie here today. Rather, we are going to discuss something called Kosal Movement in Western Odisha. So, this has ingredients of frustration, this has ingredients of seeking legitimacy, this has ingredients of powerful forces coming together for a particular demand. It also has ingredients of political one-upmanship, it also has ingredients of political performances, ritualization, the religious practices, the symbolisms, secularism, secularization, you name it and it is there. But ultimately this happens to be as of now, an unsuccessful movement or an unsuccessful subnational movement. So let us discuss about it. And in order to discuss this one, there is not much research work done on this as of now, but one of the key scholars who has written about it is Professor Subrata Mitra. So he argues that Kosal movement became unsuccessful or has remained unsuccessful for certain reasons, whereas movements like Chhattisgarh movement, movements like Jharkhand movement or Uttarakhand movement or that of Telangana movement have become successful for certain other reasons. So let us discuss it in this case study. The historical background of this entire movement is that Odisha was created as the first linguistic state in pre-independence India in the year 1936. So the 1st of April is celebrated as earlier it was called Utkal Divas, now it is called Odisha Divas. Now 1936 linguistic state means that all the regions where a dominant population was speaking in Odia were consolidated and made as part of the Odisha state. This is not exactly the representation of Odisha state, but they were made part of the Odisha state. This included both the British portion of coastal Odisha as well as western Odisha and central Odisha called the Garjat states or the princely states. These princely states were not independent, rather they were dependent on the sovereignty of or the power that was given to them by the British. But many of these states had created ancient history and lineages for themselves. So the background story of Kosal movement starts from there itself. Once all these linguistic states, all these regions were consolidated as part of one linguistic state of Odia speakers, the division started that Odisha, its coastal portion, were most dominant in this movement of a separate Odia state. But the other bigger portion, and that to the western part and southern part of it, did not speak the Odia language that was predominantly spoken in the coastal belt. So linguistically there was a difference. Second, because they were at the coastal Odisha, the groups were at the forefront of this statehood movement, so they were also the ones who benefited the most once a state was granted. And the Garjat states or these princely states, they remained behind. The third aspect is that this entire coastal belt of Odisha has insignificant number of scheduled tribes. They are, because it is a plain area, so the agricultural activities have been well developed since centuries, since thousands of years. So religiously and culturally also they had more prominence than the western portions of the state. So, what we witness in essence is both a ritualized cultural critique of the statehood itself. It is also about economic and political imbalance, because up till now, since Odisha became a separate state, all the chief ministers have been from coastal Odisha. Not even one single minister is from western Odisha. And even if you look at the profile of ministers, profile of bureaucrats in Odisha, most of them come from this small strip. So the grievance is also about political representation. It's also about economic representation. So subnationalism or sub-regionalism in this case is looking at long-term structural inequality, but it is presented in the image of culture, it is presented in the image of heritage, it is presented in the image of material deprivation as well as religion. And we'll come in a moment about how religion is again both a subversive force as well as a strong cohesive force. Now the Kosal movement is also about language, because Kosali or Sambalpuri, as it is widely known in Odisha, is there is a fundamental difference between Odia, the way it is spoken in coastal part, and the way it is spoken in the western part. So the language or linguistic nationalism is the first marker of difference. Second marker of difference is the post-independence period politics. Now the ex-princes created a new political party called Ganatantra Parishad to mobilize the population of these states and to, in an effect, to speak for these people. But the question here is that if these regions were backward or remained backward for this long, is it because of the coastal communities? Is it because of the Odia people, or is it because of the princes who kept their states backward without implementing many reforms that were happening in the coastal belt or in the belts where the British were in direct control? But or is it also about the perpetuation of rule of this princess rather than transferring power to the general masses? So Ganatantra Parishad was the first attempt. In the later phases, the Mitra argues that we have Koshal Krantidal and Kosal Muktirath, and they follow the similar patterns that we have seen others, the ritual performances of bandhs, rail rokos and petitions, through which they are also creating a sense of legitimacy for themselves and legitimacy in the eyes of the people within this western Odisha region, as well as an antagonistic rupture against the coastal Odisha people, who are coastal Odias. So one argument that the Professor Mitra presents here is that Kosal movement, even if we compare it with the Odisha statehood movement, never had a disciplined organizational structure. So neither it had then nor it has now. Even if we look at the very specific political organizations that are there, or organizational disciplinary disciplines that are there. For example, in Telangana, you had Telangana Rashtra Samiti, and in Jharkhand you have Jharkhand Mukti Morcha. Similarly, the different states have different kind of similar political organizations which pursued a very holistic and strategic methods in order to attain some goals. So in theoretical construction, Mitra is creating something called cultural nationalism or the politics of cultural nationalism and how it can be understood in a rational manner. So, this is the kind of hypothesis he presents here. So, the first hypothesis he calls as ideological distance, which means that wider value gap between center and region, then it leads to a stronger separatist sentiment. As I had said, Bhubaneswar lies here. Next to it is Cuttack. So, any group which is on the other side of it, it could be Sambalpur, it could be Balangir in Odisha, the distance is quite far. And because the distance is quite far, so the gravitational pull that this center can have over this periphery could be a little bit different. As a matter of fact, the ones who are here, they are even further away from the core. So, that is the reason why he is arguing about ideological distance. If there is more ideological distance, that means the way the separatist sentiments are there, it could be very strong. The second he speaks about is hypothesis 2 in terms of material disparity. Economic inequality between regions fuel resentment. And as I said before, this entire region of Western Odisha, it's very rich in mineral resources. All the rivers have their either origin in these areas of Eastern Ghats or they pass through this area, but most of the industries or the industrial wealth is in the parts which are not part of Western Odisha, which in effect has created some of the most backward districts all across India. So, in his book Everybody Loves a Good Drought, P. Sainath speaks about these districts and the extraordinary level of backwardness, the poverty, starvation that one witnesses. So, this material disparity is also creating certain kind of subnational movements. The third is that of elite exclusion, which with its core idea as exclusion of local elites from state national power also breeds regionalism. As I said before, none of the chief ministers in Odisha since independence have been part of Western Odisha. They have been political leaders who have become ministers, who have become MLAs and MPs who hail from this area, but not chief ministers or not major ministers in the cabinet. So, this is what could lead to subnational movements. What if the Brahmins, the Karans of this area have in common with the Brahmins and Karans of Kosal area? Both of them are dominant in their respective spheres, regions, but the domination of coastal area Brahmins and Karans. Karans are a group who are otherwise called Kayas outside of Odisha. They are the most dominant groups in coastal Odisha, and on the other side in the Kosal area of Western Odisha, the Brahmins and Karans are again dominant. But the coastal politics is not letting the Western Odisha Karan and Brahmins to play dominant role and share power here and also share resources here. So, they also have a reason to fan subnational movements. The fourth is weak central rule. Weak or divided central authority boosts chances of success. If here at the center the rule is or the governance structures are not so strong, then the periphery can break away. Next comes his fifth hypothesis is external support. Symbolic or material backing from external actors strengthens movement. What kind of material ideological kind of struggles that have been there outside of that field and who now once they have become successful, they are also fueling similar kind of agitation, similar kind of warfare in this area. This warfare could also be in the form of information warfare, sharing of certain sentiments, so on and so forth. And the final one is that of organizational network, in which strong civil society or political party converts sentiment into sustained mobilization. And this is where it is TRS or Jharkhand Mukti Morcha became very significant, because they provided most of these 6 hypotheses. Then in terms of conceptual framework, Mitra is also providing a life cycle of a subnational movement, in which he is giving a timeline between T1 to T5. In T1 or timeline 1, it is about ideological genesis, second comes early mobilization, then political threshold, then institutionalization, and finally banalization. Ideological genesis or T1 is about small group of ideologues framing a distinct identity. It's almost like organic intellectuals that we had discussed in the case of Gramsci. Are these organic intellectuals emerging there, or they are not emerging? If they are emerging, how they are emerging? And once they are convinced that a certain framework is going to work, they implement it at the local level in terms of protests, petitions, symbolic acts, and limited form of organization. The Kosal Kranti Dal and others that I just mentioned, they are also part of this T1 and T2. But we don't see the formation of a political party and entry into formal electoral politics or the rest 3. That is the reason why Mitra argues that the Kosal movement has only attained the first 2. It has ideological genesis and it has early mobilization. And as a matter of fact, the most of the mobilization of this subnational movement is happening on social media rather than on the ground. So this is not to discount the role of social media, but rather to say that when most of the activities are done on social media, then ground level politics doesn't become very strong. But what it can also lead to is that people have a lot of resentment against a certain group of people, but they do not know how to channelize it, because the leadership itself is fragmented and does not come across as a cohesive one. Second, when he is talking about Kosal movement and Telangana movement, he says that Telangana had a cohesive political party in the form of TRS that I just said, and Telangana mobilized across caste and class, whereas in Kosal it was primarily driven by the elite Brahmin class and the elite current class, who were not able to find their voices in the melee of coast versus the west. Third, Kosal movement happens to be fragmented both culturally as well as emotionally. If you look at the map or a rudimentary map of Odisha, then you see that although the claim is that only this small strip of land is part of coastal Odisha and this other entire part can be part of Kosal, but culturally they are not the same. Linguistically also they are not the same. For example, the Sundargarh district, which is also part of northwestern Odisha, does not speak Kosali or does not speak Sambalpuri. They have something called a Sundargarhi the language or a dialect of Odisha. So there is no uniformity there. Second is of this entire area was constituted of different princely states or Gajat states. Out of that, the Patna state was the most significant. Now Patna state and the entire royal family is part of one political party or the other, and they have enjoyed power since independence of India. So if they would like to have a separate the political party and to lead it for a separate statehood, then they don't know whether it will come back to haunt them, and somebody else is going to be powerful there. So they also have their own caste, class, cultural and emotional kind of issues. And the entire southern Odisha speaks a different language and dialect in comparison to that of western Odisha, where the Sambalpuri or Kosali is a dominant language. But according to Subrata Mitra and most of the German scholars who came to Odisha and worked on Odisha, the biggest factor for Kosal movement not to become successful is the cult of Jagannath, who has his base here in Puri. Although an alternative kind of cult is being created in the form of the Samaleswari goddess, but the pan Odisha recognition of Jagannath is not being countered by that. So if it is not counted, so Jagannath cult becomes an Odia identity. And if you want to break away from this Odisha, that means you are questioning Jagannath. You are questioning your identity as a follower of Jagannath. So this leads to both weak organizational base and weak the symbolic or weak fragmentation of the representation of certain ideas. Because as a matter of fact, most of the erstwhile kings in this region identified themselves as Gajapatis. So although the Gajapati of Puri became preeminent, but they were all minor Gajapatis in all these Garjat areas. And they all identify themselves with that of Jagannath as the first Sevayats of Jagannath or the first servant of Jagannath. And at the same time, they are also the what are called in Odisha as the walking Vishnu. So that way, the break in terms of religiosity and Odia identity, which is constructed through a religious identity, is also questionable here, which was not the case in Telangana. In Telangana, it was more secular and mass mobility led the movement of backward castes, of upper caste, as well as that of Dalits and Adivasis. So when TRS came to power, the leader of that party did not speak in the language that I am the king, I have created it. So or build it in the language of how Nizams were there. No, it was not about Nizam. So the Kosal state, when they are speaking about Kosal, it's more about religious and mythical identity of this area being part of an imaginary or mythical Kosal rather than a more rational one. And as I have discussed, this entire area is quite backward in terms of development indicators, so which is fueling a lot of the inequality related issues, but because there is no internal coherence, so the argument gets fragmented in terms of internal colonialism, but nothing more than that. Myth making is also very significant. As I said, Gangadhar Misra's Kosalanand Kavyam tried to glorify Kosal with its royal past, and every Raja there wanted to become the Rajput, and they created those long lineages, long genealogies as to what happened and how they became Rajputs and how they were original Rajputs. So Mitra calls it the idea of Rajputization, but he also claims that none of them were actually Rajputs. And political weakness, as I said, it is a big issue in this case, because most of the leaders there, whether big or small, they are either part of Congress or BJP earlier, and in the present context are either part of BJP or Biju Janata Dal. So Biju Janata Dal under Navin Patnaik for 24 years was able to keep this movement under the check by co-opting its leaders from time to time. So BJP in the present context is also doing the same thing, but because this discussion is not regarding politics in terms of party politics, rather in terms of how ethnicity is created as well as ethnic identities are created, how the political rituals are created. So, ritualization of politics is at a much rudimentary scale rather than moving beyond the basic and creating very strong images of Kosal, very strong images of the region itself. Next, all Odisha governments over the past 70 years have patronized the Western Odisha, Sambalpuri art, music and textiles. So, the ones who are part of this art, music and textiles, they do not find any reason to strongly dissent against the state. And the state itself is also quite strong, that is another case. But the symbolic representatives are also given an Odia identity, not that of a specific Kosal identity. So, the division between the coast and the rest is not so significant according to the Mitra. And Bhubaneswar itself with its modern characteristic is incorporated within the dimension of ritualism. And civil society movements are also not the strong. As I said, most of the things are happening online on social media. So, the daily kind of activism is missing. So, in effect, Mitra argues that it is a stalemated subnationalism, which in effect, although there are structural inequalities, but because the Kosal identity itself is highly fragile and fragmented in terms of caste, tribe and microethnic divisions. So, all of them are not coming together in order to create a cohesive identity. Even the symbolic politics, symbolic rituals that are being enacted, they get coalesced under the broader identity of Odia and Odisha, or under the broad identity of Hindu nationalism, or under the broad identity of certain tribal nationalism, or under the broad category of being neglected in terms of poor in terms of resources, rather than saying that okay, this is what we are and there is a clear cut division between us and them. The otherization of coastal Odisha has not happened the way it happened in the case of Bihar, Jharkhand, in the case of Uttarakhand, Uttar Pradesh, or in the case of Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. So, in an essence, ethnicity, when it is constructed, as we saw, is a process. Ethnicity is not primordial, even if primordialism is being manufactured or is being evoked. It is something in process. Second, political one-upmanship or political choreographies have their own limitations, because unless and until a strong ethnic identity is created, it may or may not lead to a strong political identity. So, the movements then require the non-fragmented caste, class, tribal orientations, so that a new nation can be created, which is politically, culturally, linguistically, as well as ritually and symbolically a holistic figure. So, these are some of the discussion questions that we have. You can check it and we can discuss these questions in subsequent time. And these are some of the readings that you can have. One of the key readings is this that I have discussed, but you can also go through Nivedita Mohanty's Odia Nationalism, Quest for a United Odisha, which is also kind of very interesting, because what we see here is that the ingredients of Odia nationalism that happened in the pre-independence period, which was against Bengali domination in Odisha, has become a playbook for leaders in Western Odisha, but unlike what happened in the coastal part, it's not being worked out that beautifully in the western part. Thank you.